Good afternoon, everybody. How are we doing? Thanks very much for having me today, Ryan. I'm going to walk you through something a little bit different today. I'm not going to try and sell you anything. I'm just going to try and show you what a healthy building looks like. So you'll all be aware of what's happening in the world with this super pandemic. Thankfully, New Zealand, through strong leadership, is back to where it needs to be and functioning pretty well. But the next step is, what happens next? How do we manage these buildings, and how do we proceed? So I'm going to walk you through this very, very slowly and gently. It's got an orientation around defence, but it applies to any piece of infrastructure, any piece of building, etc., where people are moving through it and transacting through regularly. So, what is the new norm? It's reassuring our people, it's reassuring personnel, staff, and families, making them feel safe and secure. How do we take them on that journey so that they can return to work seamlessly? They feel comfortable to be back into these environments. There's when we look at what's happened in Wellington and Christchurch with earthquakes, etc. How do we bring the same nervousness applies? How do we bring people back into the fray but back into the building where they feel comfortable? How do we balance that between working from home, etc.? There's obviously governance. How are we keeping them safe? How are we following all of the criteria of not only the law but what our health and safety policy is, etc. Getting that environmental quality right, and now more than ever, being able to demonstrate to all of the people that come in our building, whether they're our employees, our staff, etc., what's happening in the building, what is the environmental, what's the air quality, what's the particulates, how comfortable they're feeling, etc., so that they can return and be comfortable in that world. How do we respond and adapt faster? What should we be learning? There's not going to be one size fits all. What do we do to bring this to life? And then getting continuity working. Whatever happens in the future, whether it's work from home and a balance, how do we actually get this working so that people can feel comfortable for continuity and we know what the new norm is? So what are our three core areas of focusing on? Protecting people, securing places and sustaining operations. So you've all obviously been walking around New Zealand in the last few months. You've had personal protection equipment on. You've had protocols about how you enter a building, what you do, etc. You all would have seen cameras which are testing temperature, etc. So none of this is new, but it's how do you establish it and make it less imposing? How do you make it a little bit more everyday so that people they see the value of it, they see the process, but they're not intimidated by it? Air and surface quality, social distancing. Even in New Zealand today, at level 1, there's still a nervousness around distance, etc. How do we make that comfortable? How do we give people instruction that makes them feel comfortable? And how do we take them on that journey? And as I said earlier, air and surface safety is going to become more and more in the limelight, to the fore. How do we surface that to people? How do we show them what's happening in their environments? How do we demonstrate that their building is a safe and healthy place to be? But then there's also sustaining operations. There are some things that you can't do remotely. We need to return to base and bases to actually do the everyday things that we do. We've got to deal with critical situations. We've got to deal with assemblies of people. The new norm is completely different, and how do we be prepared for it? What's our state of readiness? Are we compliant? And what's our response? How can we move fast? I think as New Zealanders, we can all agree that we've been very, very fortunate to get to where we've got today. And what will our response be in future if, I hope it never happens, but if something was to happen? So, safely bringing people back into our buildings. There are a number of scenarios that we look at today: DoD, factories, office buildings, airports, etc. How do we make people feel comfortable? How are they going to move into these large venues? If you look around the world today, it's certainly a challenge getting people into venues, etc. How do we make all of these things move seamlessly? How can you move from one to the other? How can you work effectively, make it safer, and keep it safer? So it really gets us to what action do we need to take? Equality and security, people, places, and operations, and then real-time building analytics. What are the metrics that we can use? What's the software we can use? What's the functionality that we can use? It's going to enable this to be surfaced. You can manage it quickly. It might be reactive data. It might be preventative data, and it also might be predictive data. How can we take that data, mash it together, and get a single view? It's something that we can push to the people that work in all of our infrastructure. They can self-manage, they understand what's happening through different parts of the buildings, and then how do we operationalise that? So we really come to the kind of crux of the matter, and I'll walk you through this slide quickly so I don't get too boring. But it's really, if you look across this could be any infrastructure, any building, etc. And I'll move you from the top, we talk about the occupant app, and I'll move you clockwise and just talk about some of these aspects. The occupant app, how do we actually measure, and track's a scary word, but how do we measure what people are doing? How do we understand how they're moving through a building? How do we monitor them? Not restricting them, not harnessing anything that we shouldn't, but how do we monitor them so that we can provide a safe environment? Negative pressure. Today, if you know, there's obviously been significant activity in hospitals. Negative pressure is how we control the air, not only in a hospital ward anymore, but how do we control the air in bathrooms or facilities in a building so that basically there isn't a spread of germs, etc. And how do we manage that and know that the air pressure is keeping that well managed? PPE, how do we know people are wearing protection where they should be wearing it? How do we know that we've given them the correct instruction, we've inducted them properly, so that when they actually move through the building, they're compliant and following all of those scenarios? The last thing we want is someone that hasn't followed that regime and they're moving freely through the building and we haven't monitored or tracked them. Enhanced air quality, the simplest things. How often are we cleaning filters? How often are we basically changing and maintaining parts of the system, the HVAC system, so that the air quality is enhanced all the time? How are we purifying the air, keeping it clean? What statistics are we understanding? Where and what are we learning about the building? Because it's very, very important to realise that what we do here will be vibrant and will change. As we move in and out of lockdowns, and thankfully we don't have a lockdown, but how will we also manage if there is some type of incident, etc. Sensors become even more critical in a building, and those sensors are going to lead into the platform when we talk about the trends and the analytics. How do we read them? How do we take an enterprise building system and understand what's happening right across it? And then how do we react? How do we clean a building? You would have seen that there's a huge discussion going on in the world about how we return people to planes. How do we get people from one airplane into the terminal, then clean the aircraft so that the next batch of people can enter that plane and have a comfort around what's happening. Security. Someone has to have a view of this. Someone has to manage people's privacy data correctly. Someone has to basically have an overview. How do we understand what's happening? How do we have standard operating procedures? This is a new world. People are learning new things, and all the time. We can't rely on 1, 2, or 3 people and having to train those people. So we take that training regime into the software so that we can apply more and more resource as we need it. All of the software runs the standard operating procedures. We can change them dynamically depending on what's happened in the day, etc. So it's a vibrant system. It's moving. If we've learned anything from what's happened to our country recently, it's that we need to be dynamic and flexible, and this is what enables that. Temperature screening when people entering, still pretty critical. It's fallen away a little bit, but what will the future of that be? Could it be used for other things to understand sickness, etc.? That's not, thankfully, COVID. But also we then get into things like people counting and flow monitoring. When you look at the access control, everybody will be, I would imagine today, has an access control, whether they're entering a building, entering a base or something along those lines. This can be used to restrict the numbers of people that assemble in a particular area. So because we can count, we can understand who's using PPE or not, we can then restrict the access to certain areas of buildings so that we don't actually push people together. So it means that not only are we controlling the monitoring, the flow of people, but we can also control the numbers. It means we can spread people throughout the building much more successfully and actually, in a much more positive light, use the space much more successfully. Touchless access control. We all know that contactless or touchless is the future. How do we bring that to life? How do we make sure that no part of what you're doing on a daily basis interacts that could cause you harm or could spread? And really bringing that healthy building to life is all of these parts. Crazy things in the future as people make their way through airports, as people come up to security gates, etc. How do we manage them with biometrics or PPE? You know, all of these things are the future, may never happen, but they're options which are available. So starting safer, morning arrivals shouldn't be a concern. And really, it's the simplest of things. How do we bring people into that room? People temperature screening, frictionless access. All of those things now have fallen away in New Zealand, but we want to be on our guard. We want to understand how these things can change. Some parts of hospitals obviously still have this regime, airports, etc. So for us, this becomes really, really important in these areas. Less issues that are happening around our daily lives, but still something that we need to be really, really aware of. How do we reassure occupants and operators? How do we show statistics and push statistics to people? It becomes really, really critical to empower people to self-manage. If you look at the image in the bottom right-hand side, you can see that people have their own data. As they move through the building, that data is updated. It tells them what's happening in that particular area, gives them comfort. We all know that if the more data we push to people, the more data we empower people with, that's not specific necessarily to them, but to their environment, and they're able to understand what's going on and feel that measure of no concern. Contact tracing, unfortunately, a way of life at the moment. If anything should go wrong, you know, how do we contact and manage those people, even for sickness? How do we understand how people are moving? How do we understand where they've been, what we need to manage, etc.? And really, frankly, in its most basic, ignoring the pandemic, how do we give air quality, better air quality in New Zealand? People that may suffer from asthma, respiratory disease, etc. How do we actually manage that so there are less occupancy, the air temperature is managed well, we're able to have a service or a maintenance regime that's much easier. That becomes incredibly critical. And as we talked about, the social distancing, automating that so it's not uncomfortable. The new norm is making sure that we don't have too many people pushed together, etc. Just if there's a circumstance, and how do we make that a positive experience rather than something that's been daunting as it has been in the past. We really get into the specifics here, and this is a little bit more about the technology and even simple things. The future's brought some challenging scenarios for us. If you look to the right-hand side, even with the basics of the bathroom, you know, how do we purify the air there? How do we keep moisture to a minimum so it's not spreading? Understanding the temperature in the room, hand washing analytics. We're getting down to some really, you know, some important things. HEPA filters, which are give a much higher air quality output. All of these things are really starting to become critical.
Just jumping in to join you for a moment. We've gone a little bit over our 8 minutes, and I'm just going to come in here and ask if you would kindly be able to summarise and
Sure.
bring your presentation to a close.
Absolutely. So look, thank you very, very much for your time. You know, to push all this a little forward, I'll move through very, very quickly. This is something that Honeywell's doing. You'll see President Trump in the middle at one of our sites. Very topical photo for today. We would welcome the opportunity to be able to have a conversation with anybody today. It's a very, very simple metric to bring this to your attention and to show you how to move it forward. And we'd welcome that moment to do that with you. Ryan, that's it.